Everyone who follows ancient history has heard of the temple that broke the timeline, a monument older than farming, older than pottery, older than the wheel itself. Almost nobody has ever heard of a quieter site that may have come before it. In northern Syria, a small, unassuming mound called Tell Qaramel has produced radiocarbon dates that push some of its stone towers earlier than Göbekli Tepe itself, older than the very site that was supposed to hold that record. That one single fact means the whole story we tell about who built the first monuments and why may genuinely need rewriting. But to understand exactly why, you first have to understand what changed the moment Göbekli Tepe was found. For most of the 20th century, the standard story of the birth of civilization went roughly like this: people settled down, farmed, and only once they had reliable food surpluses did they finally build temples and monuments. Then, in the 1990s, excavation began at a hill in southeastern Turkey called Gobekli Tepe, and that whole order was thrown into question. Its massive carved stone pillars, arranged in rings and decorated with wild animals, were built by hunter-gatherers, people who had not yet domesticated a single crop, roughly 11,500 years ago. That completely reversed the old assumption. Monumental building, it turned out, could genuinely come first, and farming might have followed simply as a way to feed the crowds those monuments kept drawing together. Göbekli Tepe became famous almost overnight. Documentaries, magazine covers, museum wings built around it. And for good reason, it genuinely rewrote a chapter of human history. But a find that famous can also cast a long shadow over quieter sites nearby, ones that may be telling an even earlier chapter of the very same story. About 60 miles from Göbekli Tepe, on a small tributary of the Cake River just north of Aleppo, sits a low, unassuming mound most maps don't even bother labeling, called Tell Qaramel. For decades it drew almost no outside attention at all. It doesn't have Göbekli Tepe's dramatic carved pillars or towering visual scale. What it has instead is something almost as significant: extraordinarily early dates. Starting in 1999, a joint Polish and Syrian archaeological team began careful, methodical excavation here, led by archaeologist Ryszard Mazurowski. What they found, layer by careful layer, were the remains of at least 5 separate circular stone structures, built and rebuilt across many centuries, some of them true towers rather than simple platforms. One of those towers stood on a stepped, carefully terraced stone base, deliberately engineered rather than a random pile of stone. Someone here clearly understood how to build upward and outward on purpose. And crucially, this genuinely wasn't a domestic structure of any kind. Nobody was cooking dinner, storing grain, or sleeping inside a stone tower built like this one. It was built, deliberately, for something else entirely. So the obvious next question is a simple one. When, exactly, was all of this built? And that is precisely where Tell Qaramel stopped being a footnote and started being a genuine problem for the accepted timeline. Radiocarbon testing on charcoal recovered from the foundation layers of the towers returned dates that stunned the excavation team when they first came back from the lab. The earliest structures at Tell Qaramel date to somewhere around 10,800 to 9,600 years before the Common Era, on the calibrated radiocarbon timescale researchers rely on for sites this genuinely old. Göbekli Tepe's oldest confirmed layer dates to roughly 9,500 years before the Common Era. Do the arithmetic, and some of Tell Qaramel's stonework may predate it by 500 years or more. Some researchers place it even earlier still, making Tell Qaramel, by at least one reading of the current evidence, among the very oldest known monumental stone constructions found anywhere on the entire planet. That claim is not universally settled. Archaeology rarely deals in perfect certainty, and specialists continue to debate exact chronologies, sample contamination, and how directly comparable the sites really are. But even the most cautious specialists agree on the core point: Tell Qaramel's earliest stone towers are genuinely, comfortably older than settled agriculture anywhere in the region. The people who built these towers were not farmers of any kind. They were still hunting, still gathering wild grain by hand, still living in a world without pottery, without the wheel, without a single domesticated animal to their name. And they built stone towers anyway, which is exactly the puzzle that made Göbekli Tepe famous, appearing again, on a smaller mound most people have never once heard of. So if this wasn't agriculture, and it wasn't housing, what was it actually for? The honest answer is that archaeologists are still piecing that together. One of the excavated towers shows clear, layered evidence of having been used and modified over an extremely long span of time, its floor carefully replastered and rebuilt across many, many generations. That kind of sustained, repeated investment in a single structure suggests it held real, ongoing meaning for the people who kept coming back to it, not a one-off building project abandoned after a season. Excavators also uncovered human burials in and around the site, some of them treated with particular care, hinting at ritual practices tied to specific individuals or ancestors. Put together, the towers, the careful burials, and the centuries of continued reuse all point toward a gathering place, a site tied closely to ancestors and ritual, built by people who had not yet settled into permanent farming villages. That's remarkably close to what researchers now believe was happening at Göbekli Tepe too, shared ritual sites built by mobile groups, possibly the social glue that eventually pulled people into permanent settlement. Which means Tell Qaramel isn't a strange outlier. It may be an earlier chapter in exactly the same regional story Göbekli Tepe made famous. Zoom out, and this region of northern Syria and southeastern Turkey sits at the very heart of what archaeologists call the Fertile Crescent, the broad arc where farming itself was first invented. Wild wheat and barley still grow naturally across these hills. This is, quite literally, the ancestral homeland of the crops that would eventually feed most of the ancient world. So it's not a coincidence that this same small stretch of land also produced some of the earliest known monumental architecture on the planet. Dense wild food resources meant people could gather in larger, more stable groups. Larger, more stable groups of hunter-gatherers, gathering periodically at one shared, meaningful site, are exactly the social conditions researchers now think produced places like Tell Qaramel and Göbekli Tepe in the very first place. Within just a few centuries of these earliest towers, communities across this exact region cross a real threshold: full-time farming villages, mud brick houses, domesticated animals, and eventually pottery. Tell Qaramel sits right at the hinge point of that transformation, a foot still in the hunting and gathering world, and a hand already reaching for something more permanent. That makes it less a single strange monument, and more a snapshot of the exact moment human society began reorganizing itself around permanent places instead of endless movement. And once you see it that way, the question of who was really first, Tell Qaramel or Göbekli Tepe, starts to matter a little less than the pattern both sites are part of. So if Tell Qaramel is genuinely this significant, why haven't most people outside of specialist archaeology circles ever even heard of it? Part of the answer, it turns out, is simply timing and visual scale. Göbekli Tepe's carved pillars, some of them over 5 meters tall and decorated with foxes, boars, and scorpions, are visually spectacular in a way that travels well on camera and in headlines. Tell Qaramel's towers are lower, plainer, harder to photograph in a way that instantly explains their significance to someone scrolling past on a phone. Significance in archaeology and visual drama don't always neatly line up, and when they genuinely don't, it's almost always the quieter, older site that ends up losing the popular attention race entirely. There's a second, considerably harder reason too. Syria has been in active civil war since 2011, and archaeological fieldwork across much of the country has been severely disrupted or halted entirely for well over a decade since. Sites like Tell Qaramel, already excavated only in careful part, have faced real, ongoing risk of looting, physical damage, and simple neglect while the wider region has struggled through conflict and mass displacement. That means the fullest story this mound has to tell may still be sitting untouched beneath the surface, waiting on stability that hasn't yet arrived. A site genuinely old enough to challenge how we date the birth of monumental architecture, sitting quietly unfinished and unread, for reasons that have absolutely nothing to do with archaeology at all. Step back now from Tell Qaramel specifically, and look at the much wider pattern archaeologists have been carefully assembling over the last 2 decades across this entire region of the ancient world. Göbekli Tepe, it turns out, was not a lone genius flash of inspiration sitting in an otherwise empty landscape. It was one single node in a whole growing network of similar early ritual sites now being identified across the region. Nevali Kori, Karahan Tepe, Jerf El Arma, and Tell Qaramel, potentially the earliest of them all. A whole constellation of early monumental sites scattered across the region, not a single isolated miracle. That completely changes the shape of the story. It's not one brilliant idea in one place. It's an idea that multiple communities across an entire region were converging on, at roughly the same broad moment in time. Which suggests something bigger than any single site, a genuine turning point in how humans everywhere in this region were beginning to organize themselves, share resources, and build for the long term. Tell Qaramel isn't a footnote to Göbekli Tepe's fame. On the current dating evidence, it may be one of the opening lines of that entire story. And that quietly reframes an old assumption most people still carry around without ever questioning it, the idea that impressive stone monuments necessarily require settled farming villages and organized states to exist first. Tell Qaramel's builders had none of that. No villages, no crops, no rulers we know of. Just people, stone, and a reason strong enough to build something meant to outlast them. It's genuinely worth pausing here on how archaeologists actually arrive at a specific date like 10,800 years before the Common Era, because the number alone can sound almost too precise to fully trust. Radiocarbon dating measures the steady decay of a specific carbon isotope in organic material, like the charcoal from ancient hearths and construction debris found sealed deep inside the tower foundations. Because that decay happens at a known, remarkably steady rate, measuring how much remains tells researchers, within a calculated margin of error, roughly how long ago that specific material stopped being part of a living plant. Multiple independent samples were taken from Tell Qaramel's foundation layers, and researchers cross-checked them against each other before publishing the site's now well-known chronology. That's not a single lucky guess or an isolated result. It's the exact same rigorous dating method used to establish Göbekli Tepe's own age, applied with the same careful standards, at a site 60 miles away. Which is exactly why the comparison between the two sites carries real scientific weight, rather than being a matter of which mound simply looks older to the eye. Some archaeologists now argue the very term Neolithic revolution is somewhat misleading, implying a sudden clean break, when sites like this actually show a gradual, centuries-long blur between hunting, gathering, and the first tentative steps toward farming. It's tempting to imagine one lone inventor, one single flash of insight that changed everything overnight. The archaeological record almost never actually works that way. It's slow, uneven, and driven by many different communities experimenting in parallel. Every fresh layer excavators carefully peel back at a site like Tell Qaramel adds a little more texture to that slower, messier, and ultimately far more human version of the story. And texture matters enormously here, because the popular version of this story tends to flatten everything down into a single dramatic moment, one hill, one discovery, one rewritten textbook page. The real story, the one still being carefully assembled trench by trench across northern Syria and southeastern Turkey, is considerably richer than any single headline could ever fully capture. It's a story with multiple starting points, overlapping timelines, and communities that likely never knew about each other, independently arriving at strikingly similar answers to the same basic human question. Science, done patiently and carefully over many long field seasons, occasionally hands you an answer far bigger than the question you originally set out to ask. That's exactly what happened here at Tell Qaramel. A modest mound, tested rigorously, turned out to be holding one of the oldest deliberately built monuments archaeologists have ever confidently dated anywhere on Earth. So return to that first stone tower, foundation stones fitted by hands that had never planted a single seed, rebuilt and revisited for centuries by people who came back again and again for reasons only they truly understood. Radiocarbon dating places its earliest stonework at roughly 10,800 to 9,600 years before the Common Era, potentially several full centuries older than Göbekli Tepe's own famous pillars. That makes Tell Qaramel, on the current evidence, one of the very oldest deliberately built monuments anywhere yet confirmed on the planet, built by hunter-gatherers before a single domesticated crop existed. Not a smaller, lesser copy of a more famous neighbor. Quite possibly its predecessor, the opening chapter of a story most people only ever hear starting one chapter later. It sits there still, only partially explored, in a country where continuing that work safely has not been possible for well over a decade now. Somewhere beneath that undisturbed dust is very likely still more of the answer to a question that has already reshaped how we understand the birth of civilization itself. The oldest known chapter of that story, for now, is still waiting to be fully read.